17 years ago, I had a great group of friends. While some of them had known each other since 2nd or 3rd grade, I met them at the end of high school through my first boyfriend. It wasn't instantly a great fit for me. Besides their history, I didn't share their interest in science fiction or role-playing games. But as we continued into college, I grew very fond of them and the time we spent together. Whether it was playing cards, hiking, watching a movie, or just hanging out and talking. They were my social life, but increasingly also the people on whom I counted. And that is why I agreed to engage in a perilous activity with them, spending a weekend in the country. More specifically, this was a weekend-long going-away party outside of Blacksburg. Chris and Jen were moving together to St. Louis for grad school, and he had planned a last hurrah for our group of friends. While Chris and Jen weren't the first of our friends to move away after school, this felt like an especially significant loss. For starters, there were 2 of them leaving at the same time. And Chris, well, he was sort of our hub, the life of our parties. He was always up for getting together and often the one making plans. Though she was more reserved than Chris, Jen and I had bonded over being 2 of the not so many girls in our group and some similarities in our families. There were about a dozen of us going to bid Chris and Jen bon voyage. I didn't really expect it to be a dangerous affair. I mean, it was a group of young adults having a party, out in a remote location that was rumored to be haunted. What could go wrong? I was in the last car to leave on Friday night, waiting for Michelle to return from work travel. We were missing settling in with everyone else, and daylight for our drive. Once we got off 81, it was a succession of winding, narrow country roads. It was pitch black and nearly impossible to see. We barely avoided hitting a tree at a curve that seemingly came out of nowhere. And then we were there. We were all staying at the century-old farmhouse that Chris had been sharing with some other students in his department at Virginia Tech. It was about 1 a.m. when we arrived, so most of the house was sleeping. The next morning, though, was full of activity. After breakfast, we loaded into the cars and drove to the New River to go tubing. The company that ran the tubing had one of its 20-year-old employees lead our orientation. He explained most of the run would be slowly floating down the river. Near the end were some small rapids, but we should have no problems with those, he said, as long as we avoided the rocks in the middle. It seemed to me like what we really had to fear was sunburn. One of our friends who eschewed sunscreen was already red as a lobster, but I had slathered on plenty and felt ready to go. We grabbed our tubes from the pile. These inner tubes were huge, stood on end about half as tall as I was. We set them into the water and climbed on top. The air was hot, but the water was cool beneath us. We started floating down the river together, passing drinks from the coolers that were floating in smaller tubes tethered to some of the guys. As we continued, though, we drifted apart. Soon I couldn't see Chris or Jen or about half of the others. Michelle and I ended up at the back of the spreading pack of tubes. Floating down the river next to her, the rocks that we had been warned about suddenly came into view. The rapids surrounding them looked much bigger than I was expecting. Suddenly, my sense of relaxation was replaced by worry. I was going to ride over those rapids just resting atop a dinky inner tube? I turned to Michelle. That looks kind of rough. I'm worried I'll get knocked off my tube. I was not a great swimmer. In fact, this was my first time in a river, and I didn't have a life jacket. I think I'm going to get inside the tube. I was grasping at straws, but this made sense to me. I could hang on to the tube. Plus, it would buffer me if I strayed too close to the rocks. It made sense to Michelle, too. So we climbed inside the tubes, but wrapping our arms around them was uncomfortable. So we climbed back on top of the tubes. But fear gripped me again. No, I decided inside the tube would be better. As we continued, the current sped up. The distance between me and Michelle grew. She was on a path toward the river's edge. Was I headed more toward the rocks? Yes. This was the only thing that orientation had warned us about. How do you control an inner tube? I struggled to steer, but all I did was spin in a circle. I tried to swim, but my legs were directly underneath me and my arms were wrapped around this giant tube, so that didn't work. Now I was headed straight for the rocks. How had everyone else managed to avoid them? Before I could come up with anything else to try, the river ripped the tube from my body. I was pulled under and into the rocks, head first. I was startled and swallowed a mouthful of water. Gasping for air, water swirling all around me, rocks above and below, I was disoriented, and all I could think was that this is how people drown. I struggled to get my head above the water and tried to swim away, but was no match for the powerful current. I crashed into the rocks again. I grabbed hold of the rocks and somehow pulled myself up on top of them. I thought I would sit there, catch my breath, and figure out what to do next. The rocks were slippery, though, and almost as soon as I was sitting, I was sliding back into the water, bumping into the rocks all along the way. I don't know how long I had been stuck in the rapids. I was fighting to keep my head above the water and to hold on to the rocks to prevent further collisions when I heard someone call my name. I turned my head slightly and could see Jen swimming toward me. She extended her hand. "Swim toward me," she called. I didn't think I could, but knew I had to try. I put my feet against the rocks, pushed off as much as that was possible, and kicked with all my might until I was grasping her hand. And then she towed me back to shore. She had already finished tubing by the time I got to the rapids and had seen me crash into the rocks. Jen jumped in the water immediately to help me, and I really think she saved my life that day. While, I will note, most of our male friends stood on shore, Michelle was waiting for me down the river, not knowing what had happened until she saw an empty tube float by. She saved me the tube replacement fee by catching it. I was bruised and exhausted and very shaken, but my panic had somewhat subsided by the time we got back to the farmhouse. Still, I decided I was going to exercise some caution for the rest of the weekend. So while some of our friends hit the alcohol hard when we were making dinner, I thought I would wait. One of our friends became violently ill and had to go to bed while it was still daylight. Later, when the bonfire really got going, and some of our guy friends decided to follow the tradition of the house and jump over it, I watched sleepily from the edge of the circle, curling up on my blanket in the grass. I awoke in the middle of the night, freezing and once again enveloped by water. A heavy blanket of fog had covered me and my boyfriend, who had also fallen asleep at the edge of the circle. I don't know if our friends waited until the fire went out to leave us there, or thought it would keep us warm, as long as it stayed contained in its shallow pit. The next morning, nothing could save me from saying goodbye to Chris and Jen. I could no longer pretend not to see the large moving truck in the driveway of the farmhouse. Jen's belongings were already loaded on, and after the rest of us left for home, they would pack up Chris and drive away. Despite my close call in the river, what scared me most about that weekend was our group of friends breaking apart. Their move and others have been difficult for our friendships to endure. But they have, and Chris and Jen moved back 4 years later. I'm grateful to still count them and so many others from that weekend as my close friends. In reality, they became like family to me at a time when I didn't have much. And while it was Jen who literally saved me that day in the river, I've come to realize over the years that we have all rescued each other in countless ways, helped each other through tough times, and happily celebrated together as life has moved on.